It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce you Dr. Faith Fitzgerald. She is she's professor of clinical internal medicine at UC Davis, associate dean for humanities in the medical school, one of the nation's foremost clinicians, an extraordinary teacher, an inspiration for all of us lesser mortal physicians, and a role model for providing humanitarian care and caring about her patients. She is famous throughout the U.S. Diagnoses she finds doesn't guess. With her memory eidetic, next to hers, mine's pathetic. Sherlock Holmes, she would surely impress. With her clinical skills, she's gone far, and she knows Russian history, each Tsar. In plain English or Russian, she can name Kaiser's Prussian, but alas, she can't fix her own car. The school's given her an endowed chair in humanities, which is quite rare, because every young doctor needs a role model proctor to encourage compassionate care. Dr. Fitzgerald.
I cannot tell you how frightening an introduction like that is. Hello again. The talk is about gerontophobia, which is a fear of aging, in two separate ways. And I'll tell you its genesis in a minute. But just let me mention, because of some of the questions that were going on up front and from the audience after Dr. Hirsch's talk, I think we all have to reconcile ourselves to the reality that either we will get to be very old or we'll die. And the question really is how things proceed in either case. And one of the attentions I've given recently arose from a conference that was held in Hawaii, on Oahu, about 6 months ago, which was the one-year anniversary of the canonization of an individual I want to present to you today. But the title of the conference was Caring for Our Kupuna. Are there any Hawaiians here? Kupuna, yeah, they generally don't leave Hawaii. The Kupuna is the elderly. And in Hawaii, they are having an increasing problem because of the very high cost of living there and taking care of their elderly Hawaiian parents. And they wanted a discussion on that. So part of this is prepared for them, but from it has come some ideas for you to wonder about and ponder. Few answers, many questions. Gerontophobia, and this is obviously part of Hawaii. I have the obligatory disclosure. There we go. Now this is a picture of a young man, Father Damien de Versteer, who was a Belgian priest who was summoned and then volunteered to go to the island of Molokai in the Hawaiian Islands. It was an isolation colony. And he arrived there in 1873 and functioned as a nurse and as a doctor and as a priest, a carpenter, a gravedigger, a builder, and generally a shepherd, as well as a really pesky beggar for his flock. And these were who they were, because this is the famous leper colony on Molokai, where everyone who acquired leprosy, and sometimes their families, were sent against their will and imprisoned. He was a busy man. He built hospitals and orphanages, houses. He built a very pleasant church called St. Philomena's, which is still there. And he was a nag. He would go to the government on the main islands and beg and demand medications, nurses, and he'd go to the Catholic diocese and demand those same things, and nobody wanted to see Father Damien show up on their front door, except for the lepers, because he maintained close contact with his flock and touched them fearlessly, as many people feared to do. And in consequence of that, although it was unexpected, since leprosy appears to occur in certain genotypes and not others, he began a sermon in 1883 with the words, "We lepers." He'd caught it. What does leprosy look like? What do lepers look like? It's an ancient scourge, and it's always been fearful. Not because it's terribly infectious, which it isn't. It's amongst the least infectious of all infectious diseases. And not because it kills you rapidly, which it almost never does, but because it is generally decades long. But what it does do is cause fearful mutilations and thus make your appearance to other people seem so fearful that they would kill lepers and totally avoid them or send them away to what was effectively a paradise prison, which is what they did. And joining these groups now is Father Damien. And if you see his hand, you'll see it is deformed, and his face. And it's a kind of a shock when you realize that he died at the age of 49, looking very much older. And he died of leprosy. Now, by his side when he died was this woman, and it was her anniversary of sainthood that the conference dedicated itself to. Her name was Mother Mary Ann Cope. She came from Germany originally, but as a babe in arms, and was an American citizen. And she joined a nunnery as a sister of St. Francis, and then became the mother of that house, and then became a teacher, hospital administrator, and health practice innovator. And she was criticized by the hospital executives because she kept taking in people who had nothing and who were not desirable. And they called her the care for outcasts because they were alcoholics, poor immigrants, people who had no other recourse, and she'd just sneak them into the hospital and take care of them. And she got a letter from Hawaii because that story about her got out, and they begged her to come to Hawaii to take charge of, and I quote, "our hospitals and even our schools. Have pity on our poor sick. Help us." So she went back to her house and she recruited 6 other nuns, all volunteer, and they all went to join Father Damien, as well as to do work on the Big Island and on Oahu, and wound up being called the beloved mother of outcasts. And she stayed there for the rest of her life on Molokai, where she died at the age of 80, after 35 years of caring for the outcasts there. Now, there was no therapy for leprosy. What she did was humanize the lepers. Like Father Damien, she had no fear of touching them. She made them dress well. She taught them arts and sewing and a variety of other things, and treated them as if they were valuable people. And that endeared her to them. And she died with them. So now we have to ask here in the mainland, who are our outcasts, well, some of them quite obvious, prisoners, whom some people believe should not receive highly expensive medical care. Anybody who does it to themselves, which in our culture seems to be just about everybody. Well, we keep asking the question, why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? And some of you are asking that same question as you age, things happen because of age, and how can you prevent them? And if you don't do that, it's your fault when you get older. Well, so you can eat too much, or you can smoke, or you can drink, or you can shoot drugs. I wouldn't recommend any of those things. And then the homeless are also outcasts, well, speaking literally, in our culture. And many of them are mentally ill, as we know. And then there's a very large group called the not us. And those are people who are not us. And by that, in California, we generally mean illegal immigrants, but we also mean people who don't look like us or act like us or speak like us. And then, of course, there is us, who are getting on in years. And as I say, if we don't die soon, we will develop one of these problems, ultimately. And it is not necessarily dementia, but it might be certainly being, quote, unproductive, because, there are increasing numbers of people in their 70s and 80s continuing at work, and then we get blamed for taking work away from young people. No way out. Okay. I do bioethics. Here's modern ethical thinking about how we should relate to one another as a group called human beings. And one is that all human beings have certain rights simply because they're human. And the other is that all ethical human beings acknowledge and honor those rights amongst all other humans. Now, the truth of the matter is that we have seen the necessity throughout recorded history of making up documents which outline these rights. And the first actually goes way back to Cyrus of Persia, who was that great king that liberated the Jews from Babylon and treated them as citizens of his realm and said, you can go back to the promised land, your promised land if you like, and many did, or you can stay here, and some did. And he had this Declaration of Human Rights. Fast forward through actually about 1,000 years of infringement of human rights, and you come to the Declaration of Independence, in which we, as a nation, declared from the beginning, all men are created equal. They actually didn't mean men and women, but we'll presume. And then Napoleon Bonaparte, no less, followed through with the rights of man in the French, and after the unspeakable iniquities of the first third to half of the 20th century, National Socialism and all, as well as Stalin's Russia, Eleanor Roosevelt led the United Nations in drawing up the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was probably within 5 to 10 years violated. And we live now in a world in which every day on the television or in the newspapers or over the radio we hear about genocide one place or another, people blowing each other up for a variety of reasons. And it appears that writing declarations of human rights don't work. Why not? Here's ethical problem number one. What's a human? And it sounds like a funny question, but as long as there's an us versus not us, I think that people believe that there are some other people who aren't quite human enough to deserve human rights. And we have deep suspicions. And it becomes particularly suspicious when they kind of look like us, but really aren't. And the question has been raised as to whether or not this is not a sociocultural or educational influence or a result of propaganda, but rather a remnant, and a significant remnant, in the brain of every person here and all who have lived and all who will, that we have built in to the brain an evolutionary set of suspicions against people who don't look like us and other signs that they aren't quite us. And now, as of today, we have documented, and more waiting for documentation, evidence that there were at least 3 co-species of human, but not Homo sapiens, that dwelt on the same earth as did Homo sapiens, the Cro-Magnon man, one of which, and the most famous, is the Neanderthal. Another, recently discovered up in Siberia, is Denisovan, and a third is this pygmy-like person who was found on the island of Flores in the Indonesian archipelago and was called the Flores Hobbit, 1, because he was a pygmy, and 2, because they were doing the filming of Lord of the Rings in New Zealand, close by. And they all coexisted. So, what do you do if you meet somebody who's not you? And how do you determine whether or not they're human? Why is it important? Well, if you're a buyer in of, and I unashamedly am, Charles Darwin, because the law of evolution is that that species is successful which reproduces itself. And you have to be very careful not to hook up with someone that's not, in effect, a match to your genome. So one of the questions is whether discrimination is an evolutionary remnant of humankind. What does this have to do with knowing who's human? Well, we use primal senses to discern whom we consider to be a human being. And vision is overwhelmingly the most likely. So we're very attentive to color and to appearance as to whether or not that person really deserves full humanhood. We also have a sense of hearing, and so if the music doesn't please us, and particularly if the speech doesn't please us, there's a lot of anger going around about people speaking beautiful other languages like Spanish or French or Hindi, and why don't they just learn to speak English? I mean, people get really mad at them. And then if they eat things that we find repulsive, or if they smell different, then we get mad at them for that too. And the question is that all programmed into our ancient brain? Okay, so we identify human beings, I think, as whether or not they look like, speak like, and smell like us. And there is some data that suggests that this may be true, and it's been studied by defense lawyers. Because what they were looking at was the accuracy of lineup identification. And what they found was that if a black man was attacked by white assailants, and there were 4 or 5 white guys standing up there for the victim to identify, that black man had more trouble separating white faces than a black man who had been attacked would have had, and vice versa. White people at these lineups have much more difficulty discriminating between faces amongst blacks than they do amongst faces who are white. And this whole inability really to identify people of other colors and shapes appears to be and to have its major onset from studies of school children at about the age of 13 in women and the age of about 18 or 19 in men. And that appears to be corresponding when the time of fertility occurs. Isn't that interesting? Now, lepers look different. There's a Norwegian, Hansen, who described it and gives it its eponym. Hansen's disease was a Norwegian. It's common in Norwegians. And of course, peoples on the subcontinent and in Africa and in Polynesia get it. And the fact that they look different is taken up in a newly developing science, principally born of the evolution of imaging technology, in which radiologists are looking at the brain and seeking to find what sort of external stimuli cause what sort of brain response and where it is. And this was a publication from Time magazine, and what it says is they want to know whether or not good or evil is a decision made by this older brain, which we have received from the long ancestry of Homo sapiens, as to whom to be afraid of, from whom to flee, with whom to mate, all of the essentials for a survival of our species. And they put Mohandas Gandhi as the good person, and of course Adolf Hitler as the evil person. And how is it that evil still exists? But what it does create, if this is true, we may have a major problem with human rights if the brain is going to tell us one way or the other who's human. And the question has been asked, are we hardwired for discernment of who's a human being. And it turns out that we may be. There have been studies done in very few patients, but nonetheless, that suggested that there are certain people who, having suffered injury, let's say a stroke, in one of the older parts of the brain, which are the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, and sort of the inner side, as opposed to the data brain, which is the cortex, where we store information, that this awareness of humanness is injured in people who've had injury to the right hemisphere of the frontotemporal brain. And here's a picture of it. It shows atrophy and decrease. Now, this is a disease, but its existence suggests at least one discrete site of localization in our brains of the ability to recognize others as human. This is not the same, by the way, as prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recall faces. Many of us have that. But it's, Oliver Sacks has that, for example. But this is the person who can't tell the difference between a human being and an object. I don't even understand what that means, because I think I can tell who's human. But these people will treat another human being as if they were an object to be used and not have any sense that there was anything akin between the two of them. Now, are we, the aged, an evolutionary work in progress? I'm talking of the ancient brain. Well, it turns out that the ancient aren't all that ancient in evolutionary history. As recently as 2011, people have been studying the relative ages of skeletons, buried Neolithic peoples, in Asia and Europe principally. And they found in these digs, by dating how old the bones were, which one can now do, that those who died young were the preeminent people in those graves until only about 30,000 years ago, when they started seeing people who were over the age of 30. And those people could go up to about 50. Wow. So is it the case that the majority of the structure of the human brain was done with the anticipation that a human being would look 30 or less? Until 30,000 years ago, and first of all, the author puts it well, Rachel Kaspari, she calls the shift this appearance of people's bones who died in their 50s, the evolution of grandparents. First time. There you go. And even these grandparents seldom lived beyond the age of 50. So being as old as I am, probably was unwitnessed by the majority of human beings who preceded us. So how do we see the old now? What if the ability to identify old people who do look different, like the lepers look different, as human beings never fully developed? Because there were so few old of them. I mean, just not that many people around. Now, families could recognize older people as human because their children would have known them when they were young and kind of looked normal. But what about the perception of the old among non-family members who are essentially strangers, and all of a sudden they're facing these people who look really different? And is that why we're all eager to look young? Because when we're talking about aging, we are talking about keeping our youth, either our appearance of youth, the activities of youth, and we want to be. I read the obituaries now. How many of you read the obituaries? Yeah. It's been called the geriatric social page. And I have seen obituaries for people in their hundreds, and the odd thing is it says, and she died at the age of 101 years young. I'm thinking, look at all the effort that woman put into getting 101, and they just take it away from her like that. Years young. And then there was one famous one, I remember, it was an elderly man, 98. He died of a diffuse lymphoma, and they told about him, and he was quite remarkable in his accomplishments. But the last sentence upset me a little. It said, "And he never smoked." Wasn't his fault. Now, the old used to be useful to families and societies. Now, 5-year-old kids know more about technology than most of us do. And there are two legacies of that, of the presence of the elderly. One is that women live longer than men. And this is across the world, unless they die, in childbirth. But women tend to live longer because of what a fellow named Garrett Hardin, who was a geoepidemiologist, said was the grandmother bonus. That if you have a daughter that has children, you can help her take care of the children so she can have more children. And old men aren't as good at that. And they just aren't. Now, some are very good, but most just haven't had the experiential learning that any mother of a daughter who's now having children has had. I mean, by definition, a grandmother has had children, so she knows what to do. And is therefore more valuable, since presumably more of the children survive childhood, which used to be a fairly rare event, and now can go on to populate the world. The other thing was that old men and old women had experiential craft and life wisdom. This was torn to pieces by the Industrial Revolution, and it was because now machines were doing the work, and many of the workers then, who were high craftspeople, craftsmen mostly, were getting old, and they kept walking into the machines or getting their fingers cut off, and that younger people were more agile. And that was it. So now we live in a society in which crafts and life wisdom are not considered to be as important as products. Pity. Okay, gerontophobia, the word itself, which actually exists, has two meanings. One is fear of becoming old. And by old, I don't mean by years, I mean by decrepitude. And we have a fear of aging. Yeah. I mean, you do get a little kind of uglier if you accept the social definition of beauty, which is different. Here's a birthday card, one of those funny birthday cards. It says you're 50, but you look so natural and lifelike. How is that possible? Here's one of my favorites. Yeah. Another birthday. Do you have trouble? I can't see, it's so small. Do you have wrinkles? Do you have gray hair? Of course you do. Your eyesight's going. So what do we do? What do? We spend our time equating youth with health, with virtue, with goodness. Shame on us. And we all buy into it. Here's Elizabeth Taylor at 70 years. She doesn't look 70, does she? No. Of course, actors and actresses have to do this all the time. Sometimes they really turn out badly, but what the heck. And here we have these things labeled Youth Guard. Oh, yeah. And Botox. I mean, who would have thought of the value for plastic surgery, removing your wrinkles, of one of the most potent biologic toxins ever discovered? I mean, talk about hubris, the first plastic surgeon that said, let me try this. The cost of anti-aging products in the U.S. is estimated to reach $114 billion. Billion with a B. By next year. And they complain about the high cost of medicine. Come on. Okay, are people who look different not human? And what do we call them when they're not human, but kind of looking like maybe they should be human, but aren't, and they're trying to fool us? We call them monsters. Here's a picture of a woman who had acid thrown in her face by a jealous boyfriend, and who, before her plastic surgery, which is the other picture, told the story that a little girl had seen her before the operation and had run to her mother screaming, "Monster! Monster, Mommy!" And then there's this poor guy who had a face transplant, and after that, he had a face transplant after this picture was taken, I just thought I'd tell you. So it was presumably worse. And he said he was not a monster anymore. And then he added, and he even thought he looked younger after surgery. So I have to ask the question, are we also monsters? Are we being seen by a certain fraction of the population as potentially not human, and going beyond not human, being monstrous? Let me point out to you that there is another description of gerontophobia, which is not the fear of aging, it's the fear of associating with old people, because we are vampiric in the sense that we're trying to suck the youth out of them. It's one of the phobic disorders. It's very rare, happily, and you'll seldom see anybody experience it, because unless you're young, you don't see them. But what's really interesting to me is I was raised in a family that loved European folklore, so I kept getting read all these terrible stories about little kids that went into the forest. And who did they meet there? Oh, old witches. Old witches in the woods. The old hags. Evil, not human. Now, women live longer than men, so in effect, there are more hags around. Now, some of you may recognize this. This is in makeup Boris Karloff as the Mummy, one of the undead. You can see how people could get a little confused. This is one of my favorites. Yeah. Vampires stay young by sucking the blood and life out of the young. Maybe the gerontophobics aren't all that wrong, particularly given the popularity now of vampire stories for young people. What are they thinking? They may be looking around. Because this generation of the very old, people who are 90 or in their hundreds, are the longest lived, most biologically vigorous generation of human beings ever to exist on the face of the earth. Consider the last 100 years. Even if they missed the great influenza epidemic of 1918, which killed 60 million people, they lived a third of their lives without antibiotics. They didn't have modern surgery. All of the immunizations and public health measures were primitive at that time or non-existent. They lived through 2 depressions, well, 1 depression and 2 world wars for many of them, and just lived. They've been highly culled. So for those of you in your 90s and 100s, I'm proud to know you, because you are extraordinary people. For the rest of us who are not that old, perhaps we do stay young by sucking the blood out of the young. Now, the question for all of us to ask of ourselves and of younger people is, how do you feel about the old, about being old? A lot of us rebel against it. We say that shouldn't be happening. And we're going to stay young, either the appearance of youth or certainly the vigor of youth, by exercising and eating the right stuff and taking the vitamins and taking the right hormones and so on. That's our task. It won't work, by the way. You know, he said something like a percentage died. Well, 100% of us are going to do that. Yeah, all it depends is how you choose to do it. Are some people more aware of the humanness of the other than other people? And there is evidence that suggests that there is. And this also may be a product of the brain. Here's a study, and these are not real photos, but they scanned the brain of a young woman using one of the metabolic scanners, either a PET scan or a functional MRI, which actually measure the activity of the brain rather than just look at its anatomy. And while they were scanning her brain, they stuck a needle into a vein, with her permission, of course, and she suffered pain. There it is. And it was in the frontal temporal lobes. Then they continued to scan her brains and brought in another young woman, and she was watching that young woman getting the needle stuck in her. And while that was happening, and she was not now in pain, her brain lit up from the witness of someone else's pain. And that is empathy. So we have a system built into our brains to a greater or lesser degree of being able to have empathy. And that's important because of what empathy isn't. Empathy is not pity. It's not sympathy. And it's not an intellectual discernment, sorry for your loss, kind of automatic. What it is the ability to honestly say, that could be me. And if you say that about any other human being, you are now officially recognizing them as a human being. It could be me, suffering in such a way. And they say, I know how you feel, not as just one of these sort of things you say to people who are suffering, but rather because I feel it too. My brain is lighting up in the area of pain or suffering, which you have now. Is there a bell-shaped curve of human definers and empaths? This is the question that was being asked by the Time magazine article, as to whether or not that empathy, that ability to recognize the humanness of others, is built into the human brain. And that some people have it and some people don't. Well, at one end of this biologic distribution curve, because biologic normals are kind of the middle of this, and then there are the extremes at the distal ends of either side, but most of us fall kind of in the middle. The psychopath, the serial killer, let's say, Ted Bundy, doesn't recognize other people as anything other than instruments to be used for his own gratification. And at the other end, you may have someone like Mohandas Gandhi, who could not ignore the humanness of others. He just could not seem to. And it probably runs along a line of self, recognizing oneself as human and therefore important, or one's family, or one's race, or one's community, or nation, or religion, a lot of that going around recently, and ultimately all people. If we concur that all the sick are human, and this is something you should know about doctors and how to choose one, to whom do doctors owe their primary ethical allegiance? Because we have sick patients, but we also have public health. This is a poem I wrote. I hope you like it. Right versus right is easy. You don't have to be very bright. The major problem in ethics is when you pit right versus right. And we grew up with that. Do they still do the Pledge of Allegiance in schools? Yeah. So we do have this. We've got liberty and justice for all. Well, you may have the one or you may have the other, but you can't have both at the same time. Liberty means doing whatever you want. Now, if doing whatever you want significantly hurts other people, then you'll get justice that will stop you from doing whatever you want, which isn't liberty, and so on. And we have this, in a sense, in the basic doctor-patient covenant. Certain aspects are not arguable, really. It's one that we are to place patient welfare first, and that we be trustworthy and dependable, and that we do not deliberately do overall harm to people. And our ability to function as physicians is totally dependent upon the trust of other people. And that is a very high mark. Let me show you something very quickly. What we do as doctors is tell our patients what to eat, what their body shape should be, what pleasures to avoid, what unpleasant things to do. I ask you to tell us the most intimate and embarrassing details of your private lives. We poke into hidden places that other people would be arrested for doing. And we will alter you chemically and physically and adjust your moods and thoughts. And when I propose this to my patients, they say, okay. How about oncologists, people who care for tumors? They say, I know what's wrong with you and how to fix it. I'm going to give you a medicine. It has side effects, though. It can wipe out your bone marrow, stop your breathing, cover you with a rash, or kill you, but you should take it. Okay. Surgeons. Huh. I love surgeons. But they have that trust which exceeds all but one other. And they say to their patients, I know what's wrong with you. I can fix it by operating on you. This means you'll be unconscious and absolutely helpless, and we'll support your breathing. Now, I'm going to cut out one of your parts. And when I do this, one, you'll be missing a part, but two, you could die or have major complications like shock or infection or kidney or heart failure, but I think you should agree. Okay, doctor. And here comes the biggie, pediatrics. Parents come into the emergency room, they're carrying a feverish child, and they spot somebody in there with a name tag, and it says MD Pediatrics, and they will hand their child over to this absolute stranger with a white coat and a name tag, and the person will examine the child, and she may come back and say, your child's very sick. I intend to treat her with medicine and possibly surgery. I know there are risks to both, but I think I know the right thing to do. Shall I go ahead? Oh, yeah. Astounding, the degree of trust. And it is axiomatic, I tell the students constantly, that we all have to conduct ourselves in such a way as to justify that awesome honor of that sort of trust. And with that trust comes great responsibility, both as an individual physician and as one who always, as in those doctors, I like mine, but those other guys, is representing all physicians. Now, doctors take an oath, and here's where we come to the conflict part. In the original oath, which most Westerners take, although there were antecedent oaths and they are used in other nations, I will come for the benefit of the sick. Now, the students often write their own oaths, and professors sometimes write new oaths, and the World Health Organization at Geneva, or the World Medical Organization, wrote this one. I solemnly pledge myself to consecrate my life to the service of humanity. The health of my patient will be my first consideration. Problem. I am a physician to individual patients, so the care of my patient is the greatest good. But the social directive says the good of the many outweighs the good of the one. Now what do I do? Because this, which has long been known as the public health paradox, we'll call it the social health paradox, says that personally, economically, or biologically, the best interest of the individual and the good of the group may be at odds. Typhoid Mary. It wasn't very good for her to be imprisoned, but it certainly wasn't good for the group who hired her as a cook to spread typhoid. And the doctors had to make a choice between whom to treat with greatest respect. Now, we pay taxes. That doesn't do me a whole bunch of good. Military service, we ask young people to go and potentially die for the good of the group. We give immunizations, which have side effects, in order to provide herd immunity, so we're working for the group. Quarantine, as I mentioned, and we have reporting laws. If any of you, I decide, are not unfit drivers, I am by law compelled to report you to the Department of Motor Vehicles. Or, if you are wounded by a gun or carry a gun, I have to report that too. And if you're a criminal, I'm going to get you in trouble. That's certainly not what you want me to do. And human experimentation is always putting an individual at risk, because by definition, experimentation, you can't get a good idea of risk-benefit ratio because you don't know the benefits. That's why you're doing the experiment. And people have died. All right, now we face the social health paradox. Rationing. Too many people are spending too much money on health care. And principally the elders, that's us, who we say are the majority of money spent. certainly out of Medicare. Most of it spent in the last 5 years of life. And we have young people suffering, they say, from having to take care not only of their own children, but now of their own parents. And as these young people get older, they may then become themselves seniors, caring for even more seniors. Tremendous drain. And the truth is that the chronically ill, the disabled, the dying, and the physiologically old, if you survive long enough, are drains upon the Commonwealth. And doctors make this worse. Some patients are very expensive to diagnose and treat. Money is tight. By the way, inappropriate testing and therapy are always inappropriate, and that's not specific to the aged. And some patients are a burden, the very old and helpless or demented, but also people through many stages of age. And shall I, as a doctor, adjudicate social worth in making distinctions in care? Well, there's the old story about the Eskimos who get on the ice floe when it's really cold and food is short so that their children can survive. On the other hand, there was this fella, Governor Lamb of Colorado, who actually came out and said, elderly people who are terminally ill have a duty to die. And I'm thinking, what do you mean by terminally ill? You know, if I'm 100, my lifespan anticipation is maybe 6 months to a year or two. You're running out of figures here. Is that terminal? All life is terminal. Where do you make the decision? He said, you've got a duty to die and get out of the way. He was then 48. But then he uses this interesting phrase, let the other society, our kids, build a reasonable life. I checked. This is very like the useless eaters phenomenon of National Socialism, where the state decided that there were certain individuals, the very old, the infirm, mentally ill people, seriously ill, elder people. As a matter of fact, it was as recently as the 1960s that I was, 70s actually, I was in Britain and visiting a hospital, and an old man had come in with pneumonia, and the physicians decided, and he couldn't have been more than 75 or so, that they probably shouldn't be treated, because after all, he was really old. Let him die of his pneumonia. And we think of the Brits as a civilized society. Oh, by the way, you got to wonder what he thinks now, eh? Anyhow, your job and my job is to make sure that the patient knows who the doctor is and whom the doctor represents in any relationship between us. And that has to be made clear, very clear ahead of time to both the patient and the family. And the doctor has to understand it as well, because there are many different types of doctors. There's the primary doctor. And then there's the triage officer, which reverses things, by the way. These individuals were designed to save only those who are likely to live and to let go those who are likely to die. Different role. Administrators have to account for the entire enterprise as well as the individuals within it, and thus have a different allegiance than to the individual patient. Researchers actually are users of individuals in order to, with their permission, come up with something better. And of course, the public health officer we've already discussed. Now, can any of us successfully serve both individuals and society? Well, we have a profession that does that. Somebody could go from being a district attorney to a defendant counselor, and do both, prosecute and defend. And what happens to lawyers? Nobody trusts them. Now the question is, back to the brain issue. Are our individual versus group choices, because some people move towards care of the group and others move towards care of the individual within the group. And is that biologically set? Yeah, it appears to be, at least by this experiment of nature published in 2007. And these were 6 patients who had focal damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that's part of the emotional brain. And this is the brain that generates ordinary emotions. And these people who had this part injured were offered the classic sort of ethical conundrum. If you could save 100 lives by taking one, would you do it? And within a nanosecond, these people said, sure, makes sense, perfectly logical. Well, most of us would think a little longer about that. 100 babies, kill one, the other 99 live. Wait a minute. Okay. Here's historical medical ethics. Do good, do not do evil to human beings. Now we have to answer the question, what's good and what's evil, and where does that come from? Oh, Nietzsche. Struggle between human emotion and reason. What he called the will versus the intellect. And it's how you feel about information, which is absolutely available to most people today because of the web. And it explains why, with the same data, we can go at it tooth and tongs in disagreement about such things as capital punishment and abortion and politics and evolution and immigration and religion, and now about distribution of resources. We have, said Nietzsche and René Descartes before him, a bicameral brain. We have the data brain, mostly the neocortex, and then we have the emotional brain, which is fear and anger and a variety of other things that would have served us well in early evolutionary time. And that's what neuroimaging is trying to look into now, and what they're finding, interestingly enough, is that there's a larger proportion of the brain, the older brain, attributed to feelings than there is to data storage. The temporal lobes, the frontal lobes, the hippocampus, the center of the brain. It's all how you feel about something. And Shakespeare, as usual, was right. Ethical thinking is not just logic. It's not a form of philosophy which can be worked out intellectually. It requires feelings. And we have it built into English. A couple of neighbors, some issue has come up, and they're debating it over a fence. And the first man says, "What do you think?" And the man on the other side of the fence answers, "Well, I feel strongly that." Feel? Yeah. And we all have done that at one time or another. Dare we base choices on an ethic which includes feelings? Yeah, we do. Without question, we do. Whenever we ask of whatever we do, is it worth it? And that includes all of these things up here, because worth is value, and value is how we feel about it. Good and evil are values. Right and wrong are values. Worth and no worth are values. Now these two, Father Damien and Mother Marianne Cope, based their choices on empathy. It appears that both of them could not see lepers as other than human beings like themselves. And many call them saints. And if you're a saint, you get an icon, so that people can give reverence at a picture of you. Just look at the icons. They're both young. Isn't that interesting? I mean, there's no leprosy in the Father Damien on the icon. And there certainly isn't an 81-year-old woman with a probable melanoma on her face in her icon. So we had to make them young again to be attractive. So what do I think is right to do in this continuing conundrum, part of which may be biologically based? I chose to be a doctor to individual patients, so I have to place them above every other consideration. And I'm concerned that doing things, if I have good data to believe that these things won't benefit the patient, is both costly and often inhumane. It's not just doing things, is it? It's doing the right thing. And medicalized dying seems to me to be something of a shame in many cases. And here's my opinion about caring for old people, particularly now that I'm an old person. And it is that these are these who created us in the world we live in. And how does one repay, when young, the gift of life? But I should point out that gratitude and love are feelings. They are not statistics. They are not medical data. they're how we feel. By the way, it's been suggested that fear of aging is in fact the fear of nearing death. I think that's not always true. And often the fear of growing old in both young and old people is the fear of not dying soon enough to avoid the inevitable depredations of advancing age. And sooner or later. I'm reminded of the man, and many of you may have read this in the paper because it was a local event. Must have been 5 years ago. He was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. He was a vigorous, athletic guy who liked skydiving. And so his last act on earth after his prognosis was to go out and skydive one more time, but not to pull the ripcord. Just thought I'd mention. So gerontophobia is a fear of things, physical weakness, intellectual weakness, particularly the loss of our desired appearance, loss of productivity, and loss of social worth. And we may be worse off than any other nation in the world because this nation, Canada also maybe, is almost unique in the fact that it was populated and is still being populated by individuals who leave their culture and experience, potentially their language and religion, of perhaps 1,000 years to come to a place which they know little of, so that their children will have a better future than they did. We criticize young people for not knowing history. And, Toynbee or Santayana, one of those two, kept saying, if you can't remember history, you're doomed to repeat it. Well, the Balkans know their history. The Middle East knows its history. And they keep fighting each other about things that should have been settled 1,000 years ago. Our students don't know who fought in the Civil War. Hooray! They can't get angry and join one side or the other. Our country, the future is considered more important than the past. So there will always potentially be this sense of anger almost from non-family members of those of us who are getting older as to how much room and stuff we're taking up. My opinion is, since you've got to die of something, what you should do every day is to ask yourself, how do I want to live the last day of my life? And if it's exercising to get another day, fine. If it's eating certain foods to try to be immortal, fine, because it makes you feel good to do those things. But that the evidence is, and I think it's incontrovertible, that everybody dies. And I would have you concentrate not on sort of aiming towards immortality, but rather aiming towards the best every day you can achieve. And that's a multitude of things, because you are a multitude of different people. And also find a doctor that thinks you are human and very important. Thank you.
I'm not sure that there are, this is the kind of lecture that leaves me a little bit speechless, but we can take a couple of questions and then in sort of anticipation, well, we'll take a couple of questions.
Given that they've sequenced Neanderthal DNA in humans,
yes,
were our predecessors more forgiving than we are?
Well, it's interesting. He's asking about the increase in recognition of Homo neanderthalis genome in human beings, now Homo sapiens. About 5 years ago, I remember that they had overcome an antecedent hypothesis that was true by saying, no, it's not. Now it is again. Tell you what, as long as we're going to get old, let's wait to see what the data show. And Dr. Hirsch was speaking about the sort of, and some of you asked questions about the vitamins. I'm now 40 years in medicine, and I think we travel through a circadicadian cycle of paroxysmal overthrow of the absolute truth. That every woman should do this, no woman should do this. Every man should get PSA, no man should be screened with PSA. Everybody should take vitamins, no, it's a waste of money. And everyone should get yearly colonoscopies. Well, the GI people had to give that up because they were turning into Henry Ford delivery lines. Never got to know the patient. I saw a GI fellow who came up to me looking down, looking really down. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I'm spending my entire career inside the lumen."
I'd like to make a comment. I think it's ironic that young people who have a fear of growing older, the things they love to do the most is to get drunk and get stoned, and their behavior is that of an old person.
I don't dare.
I just
Where are you? Yes,
right here.
there
I'm
you are,
sorry.
sir. Thank
You really got me to thinking.
Please.
You know, all
Total purpose of enterprise, actually.
Yes, of course. In this particular case, it's the term human and how we recognize whether someone is human got me to thinking about, a fetus is human. I mean, we all have to agree that a fetus has to be human. How do so many people see it as okay to terminate a human, and and other people don't?
Well, let me add something that I've not seen in the arguments. It is a problem for all of us, and it has to do with the fact that we're dealing with two humans, each of whom seem to have a claim. And it's very hard to separate them out and say one is worth more than the other. And that's what's being asked. So I'm thinking that this is a conundrum which should continue and not be ultimately settled with righteousness on one side or the other. Because it's just...
Okay. I noticed that both speakers today gave a disclosure when they started, that they did not represent a pharmaceutical company or whatever. When I go for an appointment with my doctor, sometimes I wonder if they are like on the cusp of getting a reprimand for ordering, too many chest X-rays preventatively or whatever. Do you see the time coming when doctors need to give a disclosure that they either work completely for the patient's best interest or that they have a financial interest in the group that they practice with, for example?
Well, the financial interest issue had to do principally with research rather than with taking care of patients. But it is clear that you do want to have physicians that you believe are working in your best interest, not in their own. And that's something that you can ask your doctor about, but it doesn't come up as often in clinical medicine as it does in academic medicine or research medicine. Okay?
Doctor over here.
Over there. Doctor over here. Yes.
May I ask you if you've authored any books or textbooks that would be available?
Books, no. I've written a lot of papers, though. If you Google me, you'll find them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Doctor, a very interesting presentation. You mentioned twice that 100% of us die.
Yes.
But in our culture, we have a mainstream concept of eternal life.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
I can't because I know nothing about it. This is, however, a very important point, which is that when we're making decisions for ourselves or for others about life or death, and we say things like, surely death is better than this life, I'm not certain we have significant data on the dead side to work in the usual way of the risk-benefit ratio. Now, there are a lot of theories, a lot of beliefs, and I can't take issue with any of them because I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that each individual man or woman has to make his or her decision. And that we have lost the ars morendi. Any English people here? Not English, British, but English students, yeah. You remember the ars morendi, the art of dying? It was a technique developed in the times of sweeping plagues in Europe, in which they had helpers, rather like verbal hospice, who would go to the dying and say very deep things to them. One of them was William Caxton, who was the first printer, really, in England, and he published his Ars Moriendi. It was, "And this time of your departure shall be better to you than the time of your birth, for all pain, sorrow, and sickness shall pass from you forever." Now, how he knew that, I didn't know, but it will bring comfort to some people, but not necessarily to others. I think my job, your job in caring for people who are dying is to mold your sympathy, your empathy, to what makes them feel best.
One more question here.
I'd like to ask that question.
Yes, please.
So I see a very vital person there engaging, and I'd like to know what you do for yourself in the way of taking care of yourself that may have led you to this state.
I have the extraordinary luck to become engaged in the tragedies and comedies, the ups and the downs, the broad interest and expertise and feelings of all of my patients. So I'm living this sort of endless adventure, and that's what keeps me going. They do.